Now, over the last 4 years or so, hundreds of young British men and women have gone to Syria and Iraq to fight for an organisation dedicated to the destruction of their own country. Some took to Islamic State's cause so enthusiastically that they became the faces of the extremists' call to arms, carrying out the most brutal acts for all the world to see. Others became soldiers, wives, killers and enforcers at the heart of Islamic State's self-proclaimed caliphate. At least 130 have died fighting for IS, but many still remain, and with the fall of Raqqa, the group's de facto capital in Syria, some are now seeking to return to the country they once and perhaps still regard as their enemy. Well, over the next half an hour, we'll discuss how governments and policymakers should now deal with the threat of returning British foreign fighters with a panel of experts and specialists and decide if there can be justice for jihadis. Well, joining me in the studio are Chip Chapman, former head of counter-terrorism and UK operations in the Ministry of Defence from 2007 to 10. We've got Baroness Neville Jones, former Minister for Security and Counter-Terrorism. Also, Haras Rafiq, Chief Executive of the Quilliam Foundation, a counter-extremism organisation. Now, before we get their thoughts, let's first hear from a British IS fighter who's now in a Syrian jail and desperate to come home and face punishment. He spoke to our special correspondent, Alex Crawford, from a secret location in northern Syria.
Shabazz, hi. Alex Crawford from Sky News.
Shabazz Suleiman's story, by his own admission, is hard to believe.
I take responsibility. I was with ISIS. I was with a terrorist organisation. I didn't kill anyone. I hope I didn't oppress anyone. I did have a Kalashnikov and a military uniform, but I didn't hit anyone, I didn't oppress anyone, if you understand. I was there with military police, but in military police, like I said, I was in the office.
He joined up with IS at the height of their fortune. In 2015, after the extremists had declared a caliphate stretching across Syria and Iraq. The motivation, Shabazz insists, was to help the Syrian people rebelling against President Bashar al-Assad and under constant attack by the regime.
It wasn't about beheading at the beginning. It wasn't about beheading or killing. It was there to defend the Syrians. I came here for that first. But ISIS changed.
But he was quickly put into training, and IS propaganda videos depict that as intense. The grammar school boy from Buckinghamshire soon found himself on the front line of the battle on the Iraqi border.
I didn't participate in the battle. I was... how do I say it? I haven't spoken English in so long. I was like reinforcements. I was basically reinforcements. But I saw the battle in front of me. You are essentially selling yourselves, not to Islam, you're selling yourselves to ISIS.
As IS collapsed amid fierce fighting in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor, he fled towards the Turkish border.
Do you feel a terrorist?
No.
Even though you were part of a terrorist organisation?
It's very weird, honestly. No, terrorists, when you think of terrorists, you think someone, with a mask and, with a sword, beheading people and terrorising people. Well, honestly, I was normal. I was just relaxed, hiding in Raqqa with Syrian civilians, Idlibi friends, they're from Idlib, playing PlayStation or go around on bike rides and normal life in ISIS territory.
Extraordinary interview. Let's get quick reaction from our panel just to what we've heard, some of what we've heard there. Pauline Neville-Jones, if you didn't know what he'd done, you'd think he was a kind of plausible, intelligent young man. Yeah. Should we take him at face value?
I'd want to hear a lot more from him and about him, and a much longer interview to come to any conclusion that I was remotely confident about before I decided, where, broadly speaking, in a spectrum of innocent and naive through to extremely cunning and well-educated and capable then of telling another story.
Okay.
All of those things are possible.
Quick reaction, that's good. So talk to him more, interrogate him more, of course. Chip Chapman, question flying on from that is, where would you do that? Keep him where he is at arm's length or let him come back?
Well, you have a range of options. You can exclude him from coming back under the temporary provisions order, so you can control how he comes back and deal with him as he comes back. So he doesn't have a free rein just to come back on his own terms. So that can be controlled by some of the legislative processes. As to what he did, if he was in combat uniform and he had an AK-47 and he was trained, that looks to me like a bit of a soldier, and therefore he looks culpable to me. But you'll also know by his feed that he did, for example, his media profile, what he said over the period. So there's lots of evidence-based analysis which will give you the ability to see...
sift through.
Yeah.
You're nodding along there, Hamas Rafiq. I mean, we saw how adept, well, the so-called caliphate seemed to exist, how adept this organisation was at communication, particularly through social media. Could this be part of that spin?
Well, absolutely. I think, well, a couple of things there. First of all, nobody who joined ISIS believes that they were a terrorist. They believe they were part of God's gang, if you like. They believe everybody else is a terrorist. So, and secondly, I think by the very fact that he said he didn't oppress anybody. He was part of the military police there. He was actually oppressing people by the moment he joined them and put on the uniform. But the point you made is very interesting. ISIS were very... they handled the media very, very well in terms of getting their messages out. They spun their messages very, very well. And I think one of the lessons that we need to learn is that by knowing that they spin media and are able to spin media very well, we need to examine whether they're spinning now, whether this person is part of that spinning back to get back into the country.
Well, I can hear a lot of agreement there, but I'm going to hold that thought because we're lucky enough to have Alex Crawford on the line now. We can see her. She joins us now from Istanbul. And Alex, I want to hear from you because you looked him in the eye and you asked him the tough questions. Did you believe him?
Well, I was able to speak to him for 1 hour, 40 minutes. We didn't know how long we were going to get with him because he was under guard with the Free Syrian Army. So I had no idea whether I had 5 minutes or anything longer. And I just talked to him for every single second that I had with him. And I found him, in fact, our whole team found him extremely evasive. He was very vague in lots of areas concerning dates, times and places, even cities, as to where he was at certain points, and yet very specific about playing PlayStations, even telling me the games that he was playing on the PlayStation, because his story was that a lot of the time he was in the office playing games on his laptop or hiding away. I thought he was extremely vague about his period in prison. He said he'd spent a month in jail, and he specifically mentioned underneath the prison of Raqqa Stadium, which of course had been blazoned across every single TV news channel and internet outlet about a week or so earlier. And when I mentioned other British prisoners who our Sky team had found in that prison, he suddenly looked very nervous and very shocked. And I asked him if he'd seen them. He didn't. He had no recollection of anyone else who was in that prison, and yet he'd been there for a month. I'd spoken to many civilians who came out of Raqqa or indeed were thrown into prison, and they remember every single detail. I spoke to a Yazidi sex slave who'd been under ISIS control for 3 years, and she remembered every single name of all the men who raped her. I think if these are traumatic events, you remember the detail in finite amount of detail. So he was very evasive on many areas, even to the point of when he actually left Raqqa. He couldn't remember the date or even the month. He kept on referring to, it was around Ramadan, it was at the start of the campaign. Very, very, and he constantly, whenever I was asking him specific detail, he would say a number of times, he'd say, I know it sounds unbelievable. It's up to you whether you believe me or not. And on occasion, at least twice, he said, I'm not used to talking English, so let me just think about the words. And I felt he was playing for time to try and gather his information. A number of the time, he seemed quite well rehearsed in when he was doing his answers. Now, even if we believe what his story, even if everything he says is true and he was disillusioned from almost as soon as he arrived there and spent his time trying to get out, he has, by his own admission, been witness to some very, very traumatic events. He talked about crucifixions, he talked about bodies being hung around the Raqqa circle. He's also been in the centre of one of the most brutal regimes in modern day history. So he is a very different man at age 22 to 3 years earlier, when he was just about to go and study international relations at Keele University. So even if everything he says is true, and he does want to come back and he says he loves Britain, he is a very, very different person today.
OK, Alex, thanks for that, and congratulations on an extraordinary piece of journalism. We used the Sky Data poll to ask if the public thinks there are or are not any circumstances in which Britons who travel to join Islamic State should be allowed to return to the UK without being prosecuted. Here are the results. Are not came in at 70%, are at 21%, don't know 9%. Well, let me go to you, Chip, on that, because I asked, when it came to one individual, the individual we've been discussing, where the discussion should take place. According to our poll, basically people think they shouldn't be allowed back in the first place.
Well, I'd accept that that's what they'd say, because, of course, with the terrorist attacks we've had in the UK this year, the dread hazard of terrorism is very high at the moment. And, of course, it's the fear of terrorism which really upsets people and makes them reticent about these chaps coming back. Now, of course, you can't make them stateless, so they've got to go somewhere, and you can only prosecute at the national level, not internationally. So they could be prosecuted in Turkey or wherever they end up. But I think we have to realise that those who are the religious zealots are probably not going to come back. They're either going to die in place or go to a new theatre of jihad. So it's the middle branch who will probably have to deal with, and even more so than that, the real difficult issue of potentially 50 children out there from British mothers.
And how do we deal with that then? Is there a humanitarian side to this? Are the British public being too harsh?
No, I can fully understand the figures, 70% saying that he shouldn't be allowed back. If we do allow them back, and I think there are a number of things before we have to allow them back. First of all, the crimes they've committed have been committed in Iraq, and therefore the Iraqi government should have first chance of prosecuting them if they want to, or at Turkey or other places. But if we do have to allow some of them back because we can't make them stateless, then we have to prosecute them.
I think we don't have the death penalty in this country, so I don't think it's a matter of the result of a judicial process. I think whatever you think about the merits of his remark, I think it's unrealistic, suppose, that actually they are all going to be killed in battle. Some of them will disperse.
Well,
that's very clear.
Could they be killed, roaming other parts of the world? Because that seems to be what's happening with these drone strikes. They're taking place in so many areas.
Well, I have some reservations about that, I have to say. I think, when it's a clear battlefield, that's one thing. I think chasing people around the world with drones I'm not so happy about that. But I do think that some of them are going to return. I suspect it'll be a minority, because I think the others will not actually want to come back because they know perfectly well what awaits them. When they come back, I agree with what Harris has just said. You take them through a process. I think the majority of them are probably going to be culpable.
On that note, I'm afraid we must end it. Thank you all very much indeed, Baroness Neville-Jones, Chip Chapman, Halas Rafiq. Very good to get your thoughts. Thank you very much indeed for adding them to the debate. And you're watching a Sky News special programme, Justice for Jihadis. Coming up, we'll find out if current laws are enough to deal with Britain's returning IS fighters and get the view of a former Guantanamo Bay detainee. Stay with us. Welcome back to this Sky News special programme, Justice for Jihadis. Now, there's disagreement about the threat posed by returning foreign fighters, with some experts and politicians arguing for tougher legislation, while others hold the belief that those that do come back to Britain may not want to attack their home country, and their experiences could actually be used for counter-terrorism efforts. So what should happen to them when they get back into the United Kingdom? Should they go to prison or be rehabilitated and de-radicalised? Well, with me now is Mazen Beg, a former detainee, of course, at Guantanamo Bay, now director of the advocacy group CAGE. Yasmin Ahmed is the executive director of Rights Watch UK, is also an international lawyer, and Raffaello Pantucci is director of international security studies at RUSI, that is the Royal United Services Institute. Welcome to you all. But first of all, to kick off our debate, I want to throw into it a Sky News data poll. We asked if the maximum penalty for being a member of Islamic State without committing any other crime, it's 10 years in prison. We asked, was it much too harsh, or at the other extreme, not harsh enough. Well, the polling results show that over half of those that took part, 51%, thought that the punishment is not strong enough, with only 11% saying it was too harsh. Well, now let's start off then with our panel and see what they make of it. Yasmin, do you agree with that poll? 10 years, not harsh enough.
I think one of the significant issues and challenges for the government is not about potentially how harsh the sentences will be or not be. It's about potentially the challenges that they face around prosecuting people when they return and the difficulties in terms of intelligence and evidence that can be used in court. So I think the real question is how the government are actually dealing wholesale with the return of foreign fighters. There have been particularly, I think, alarming and problematic statements by ministers and by government officials such as Rory Stewart, who have essentially said that anyone who is in Syria who's a British citizen who is supportive of ISIL will be killed, and that's one of our strategies to ensure that the foreign fighters don't return. That doesn't take account of, and in a sense is not obviously nuanced enough to take account of, and isn't transparent, of the fact that that the United Kingdom is only legally able to target those people who are actively participating in hostilities, not everybody.
Okay.
And it's obviously very difficult. And I think the other thing to bear in mind as well is that there is a multiplicity of tools that the government needs to consider and use with respect to this. And one of them obviously is prosecution, and an issue will be on sentences. But the other issue is about rehabilitation.
Good. You've opened that front for me, Mazen Beg. But first of all, just back to that poll. 10 years, too harsh?
Well, there's a few questions here. And first of all, we've been saying Syria, and there's no evidence to show exactly the numbers of ISIS fighters. There are many people who've gone out to fight for different organisations who the British government, in one way or the other, at least up until 2014, was supporting with non-lethal aid. So other groups, are we talking about all of them? Are we just talking about ISIS? We have to be very specific about this, because the threat, at least we can all agree on, does come from ISIS, but does it come from all foreign fighters? I would beg to say that that's not the case. And
okay, but if that were defined and assessed and monitored and investigated, the fighter returns to the United Kingdom, should they, in almost all cases, be prosecuted?
In each case, I think it has to be looked upon its own merits, as the courts would do regardless. There wouldn't be a blanket prosecution of every single person. I know for a fact many people have returned to the United Kingdom who haven't been prosecuted, and it's an intelligence decision made by the police and so forth. There's a bigger question to be asked, and that is, we've launched war after war, had 14 pieces of anti-terror legislation to stop terrorism in this country, including the Prevent programme, which is now in our schools, and the threat has only got worse and worse. We have more anti-terror legislation at this point in time than we did at the height of the IRA campaign, when 3,000 people were killed.
I want to get onto that in a moment. I just want to get Raffaello Pantucci's view on the sentencing. I mean, should it even come to sentencing?
Well, I mean, I think it does depend on a case-by-case basis. I think people who have gone to join a prescribed terrorist organisation like ISIS, which has had an avowed intent of trying to launch attacks against this country and repeatedly stated that, there do have to be consequences to that. However, can we make a blanket statement about the same level of sentencing for every single case? Clearly not. Some people have done some atrocious acts and should be prosecuted for those. Others will have done smaller ones.
Well, let's throw into this discussion the UK Independent Reviewer of Terrorism Legislation. He is, of course, as you all know, Max Hill, and this is his view on it, and I think many of you chiming along with this. Legislating, he says, in the name of terrorism, when the targeted activity is not actually terrorism, would be quite wrong. We do not and should not criminalise thought without action or preparation for action. And that, Mazen Beg, seems to be what you were saying, that we need a more nuanced approach, and there are other ways, and perhaps these other ways actually might work better.
Well, what we know for a fact is our anti-terror legislation over the past 14, 15 years simply hasn't worked. Terrorist attacks keep becoming even more bold than before, despite all of the powers our security services have. A colleague of mine, Mohammed Rabbani, recently was prosecuted and convicted for refusing to give his password at an airport, which he was holding on an electronic device, for testimony given to him by a torture survivor. So the reason why he was prosecuted was because he didn't give his password, and there was no suspicion in his case at all. So he was stopped without any suspicion, which is a law we have from 2000 under the Schedule 7.
OK, so plenty, in some views there are too much terrorism legislation, but I just want to focus it on those people who have been overseas taking up arms in some way, shape or form with enemies of the United Kingdom. And Yasmin Ahmed, you were getting on to this issue. We've discussed imprisonment in nearly all cases. Could some of the returnees be actually used as a tool in anti-radicalisation programmes?
Well, there are certainly people who have expertise in this area that suggest that actually it's very useful in terms of being able to understand and provide intelligence and expertise and knowledge that would be very important and influential in being able to deal with the threat. I think for me as well, just following on from what Mozam was saying, was that it's really important to consider the efficacy and the implications of any laws and policies that we adopt in this space.
Do you think in some cases they can make it worse?
Potentially make it worse, absolutely. And it's not something that I've only said. It's something, for example, that the UN Security Council's Committee on Counter-Terrorism has actually said.
Well, Max Hill needs to be saying it too.
And Max Hill has echoed the same statement.
And I want to bring into this somebody who has admitted fighting for Islamic State. He spoke, you may have seen it a bit earlier, to our special correspondent Alex Crawford, Shabazz Suleiman. And this is his view on what he's done and what he would do if he returned.
I regret... Mainly my family. I regret mainly that I put my family through it. Definitely put my family through a lot. I wish I can redeem myself for that.
Well, Raffaello Pantucci, that could be a powerful message, could it not? If you send him around the schools and talk to community groups, or would he be too much of a danger?
I think the difficulty is that we've seen with other examples of people who have supposedly rejected these ideas and using them as sort of vehicles to try to persuade others, it doesn't always necessarily work as you would expect it to. In some cases it has succeeded, but in other cases it has not. I think in this particular case of this individual, I don't know the full details of when he went out there, what exactly he was doing. Is he being fully open at this point about what he participated in? Well, if he is, and he comes back and faces the consequences of the legal system, either where he is now or where he is, or if he comes back
let's
here,
go with your thought. The question's there, and let's not talk about one individual, but so you form a view that there may or may not be a danger. If they're a danger, you lock them up. Now, we know what's going on in our prisons. Huge amounts of radicalisation taking place there, with relatively low-level criminals mixing with the hardened would-be jihadis, and it's a university of terror.
It's a very difficult question, how to manage this within a prison context. Now, the approach that's being taken at the moment is to try to isolate the individuals who've advocated radical ideas and try to keep them apart from the general prison population. But it's not totally clear that that's actually going to be able to manage the problem, or rather just concentrate in a specific place. But at least if you may be able to isolate them, you can work on them on an individual basis to try to steer them off these ideas.
OK, Mozam Beg, we've got to get a last thought here. If we do go along with that poll and lock a lot of people up and more or less throw away the key, could that lead to bigger problems further down the line?
It will, because it will lead to eventually, by necessity, to miscarriages of justice at some point or the other. If you've got somebody who wants to come along and say, just because I was a member of ISIS, you're going to throw the key away and lock me up, and I want to actually help to reform myself. Part of the prison issue is rehabilitation and reform, and if you're not allowed to do that beforehand, if you're not given an opportunity to come out and for example, I remember I've been imprisoned in 2014 for going to Syria. The case against me collapsed. I met in prison several people who had been part of ISIS or had been drawn towards ISIS.
OK, must end it there. Thank you all very much indeed. Raffaello Pantucci, Mozam Beg and Yasmin Ahmed. Very good to see you all. Thank you very much indeed for your thoughts. So, foreign fighters once flooded to join IS from many parts of the globe, and now as the territory they once claimed as their caliphate is being retaken. The challenge for the UK, as well, of course, as dozens of other countries, is how to rehabilitate or at least contain these thousands of indoctrinated, deeply dangerous and damaged young people who return. How that task is handled, as we've heard, will determine whether there ever will be true justice for jihadis.